Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we find ourselves at the intersection of comedy, celebrity, and the law, and at the center of it all is none other than former President Donald Trump. In what has become a headline-grabbing spectacle, Trump has publicly threatened to sue comedian Trevor Noah. And not for investigative reporting, not for a news story, not for journalism in any traditional sense, but for a joke. Yes, a brief 30-second joke delivered during the Grammy Awards, the kind of quip that makes millions laugh in a fleeting moment of entertainment. But as you're about to see, there's far more at play here than a comedian simply poking fun at a public figure. Let's rewind. It's Sunday night, February 1st, 2026. The Grammys are underway, and Trevor Noah is hosting for what he has announced will be his final year. The audience is filled with anticipation, buzzing with excitement over performances, awards, and, of course, Noah's signature humor. The evening unfolds. Billie Eilish is announced as Song of the Year for Wildflower, a win that represents the pinnacle of artistic achievement for countless performers. And then, as the cameras pan across the star-studded audience, Noah delivers the joke. In jest, he references Jeffrey Epstein's infamous private island, remarking on Trump's supposed desire for Greenland now that Epstein's island is gone. The implication is absurd, but intentionally so, satire aimed at poking fun at public figures. The audience erupts in laughter. Noah smiles, adding almost teasingly, "I told you this is my last year. What are you going to do about it?" But the moment that was meant to be comedic takes a sharp turn into controversy. By 10:01 a.m. the following morning, Donald Trump posts a lengthy statement on Truth Social. No casual dismissal, no shrug of a shoulder, but a detailed 300-word threat aimed squarely at Noah. He claims emphatically that Noah's joke was false, asserting, "I have never been to Epstein Island nor anywhere close, and until tonight's false and defamatory statement have never been accused of being there, not even by the fake news media." Then Trump escalates. In his characteristic style, he singles Noah out personally, calling him a total loser and a pathetic, talentless dope of an MC. He warns that his lawyers will take action, referencing prior legal victories against media organizations such as ABC News, which paid him $15 million, and CBS, which forked over $16 million. The implication is clear. Trump feels emboldened, untouchable, and ready to wield defamation law as a weapon. But here's the catch. From a legal perspective, this isn't nearly as straightforward as Trump seems to believe. Trevor Noah's joke was not a factual news report. It was a comedic moment at an awards show, performed live in front of millions, understood by the audience as satire, and in U.S. law, satire about public figures is afforded robust protection. It is treated very differently from news reporting or formal statements of fact. In essence, a courtroom would likely consider whether a reasonable person understood Noah's words as comedy, a key distinction in defamation law. And then there's a twist that even Trump's legal team should have noticed. Just 3 days before the Grammys, on January 30th, 2026, Trump's own Justice Department released more than 3 million pages of Epstein-related files. At a formal press briefing, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche explained that these documents were part of the full compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And within those files, Trump's name appears over 3,000 times. Let that sink in. The files contain emails in which Jeffrey Epstein and his associates discuss Trump, including news articles and other communications. There are photographs showing Trump at Epstein properties and internal emails from the Southern District of New York noting that Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously reported or that we were aware of. There's testimony from one of Epstein's victims mentioning Ghislaine Maxwell and suggesting she made herself available for Trump and his associates. A chilling glimpse, even though the files note nothing criminal occurred. There's even testimony from Trump's own Mar-a-Lago staff confirming that Trump and Epstein socialized regularly, albeit with Trump reportedly choosing to dine in the kitchen rather than at the main table. Yet despite all this, Trump continues to deny any wrongdoing. He has never been charged in connection with Epstein, and the same goes for Bill Clinton. Both men assert they had no knowledge of Epstein's criminal activities, but the question now is, how does all of this intersect with the defamation threat against Trevor Noah? On the surface, it may appear that Trump is defending his reputation. But in reality, this move risks opening a legal minefield that could reveal more than he ever intended. By weaponizing defamation law against a comedian, Trump walks a precarious line, one where the protections of satire and the transparency of the recently released files collide, creating a storm that could prove far more damaging than a 30-second joke at an awards show. And that is why every eye is now on what comes next. Because in this case, the stakes aren't just about a punchline. They are about the intricate dance between public perception, legal boundaries, and the long shadow of Jeffrey Epstein's legacy. Stay tuned, but here's the critical question, one that prosecutors, legal analysts, and even casual observers are now asking. If Donald Trump is truly considering suing someone for defamation over a joke linking him to Jeffrey Epstein's private island, is that really a move that serves his interests, or does it risk opening a Pandora's box he might never close? Think about it. Trevor Noah delivered a short, humorous quip at the Grammys, a joke meant to entertain, satirize, and poke fun at public figures. Trump's response? A public declaration, "I'll be sending my lawyers." On the surface, it reads like a strong defense of personal reputation. But from a prosecutorial and legal standpoint, this move is fraught with peril. Why? Because filing a defamation lawsuit doesn't just start a court case. It kicks off discovery. And discovery is exactly where Trump could find himself exposed in ways he never intended. Discovery, for those unfamiliar, is the phase in litigation where both parties have the right to demand documents, emails, text messages, and testimony from the other side. It is, in essence, a legal magnifying glass that can uncover every shred of evidence related to the dispute. If Trump proceeds, he is inviting scrutiny of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, a topic that has already been deeply investigated and remains legally and socially sensitive. What begins as a fight over a joke could quickly spiral into a far more complicated examination of private interactions, emails, and connections, a minefield that even the most seasoned litigators would approach with caution. To understand why Trump's move is so precarious, we need to examine his real motivation. Here's the truth that the media often overlooks. This isn't about winning in court. This is a calculated strategy designed to intimidate. Trump doesn't file lawsuits primarily to achieve legal victories. He files them to create what lawyers call a chilling effect, to send a message to others, public figures, journalists, and comedians alike, that criticizing him carries consequences. And the pattern is consistent. Over the years, Trump has filed dozens of defamation suits. He has settled some, lost many, but the outcomes aren't the point. The threat itself is the weapon. Consider his previous high-profile cases. When Trump sued ABC News and CBS, he targeted major networks with vast legal resources and deep pockets. Both organizations had strong First Amendment defenses, yet they opted to settle rather than engage in years of protracted litigation. ABC paid $15 million. CBS paid $16 million. That's a combined $31 million, all for statements that were arguably true or substantially accurate, but technically imprecise. Now, Trump appears to be using the same playbook against a comedian. But there's one crucial difference. Trevor Noah's remarks weren't framed as factual assertions. They were satire, pure and simple. This distinction is legally monumental. The First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech, has been interpreted repeatedly by the Supreme Court to safeguard satire and parody, especially when it concerns public figures. In the landmark 1988 case, Hustler Magazine versus Falwell, the court addressed a scenario eerily similar to Noah's joke. Hustler published a parody suggesting that Reverend Jerry Falwell had an incestuous encounter with his mother. Falwell sued, claiming defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that no reasonable person could interpret the parody as stating actual facts, and thus it could not constitute defamation. Chief Justice Rehnquist emphasized that robust political debate, protected speech, inevitably produces criticism that is neither reasoned nor moderate, and to hold otherwise would stifle free expression, including satire. Applying this to the Grammys, did anyone reasonably believe Trevor Noah was reporting verified facts? Or was the audience witnessing a comedian delivering a satirical commentary on Trump's well-documented friendship with Jeffrey Epstein? The laughter of millions in the audience is itself evidence. They understood the statement as humor, not reportage. And that understanding is central to the legal protections granted under U.S. law. Now let's return to the strategic dimension for Trump. Filing this lawsuit does more than just test the limits of satire under the First Amendment. It opens the door to discovery, which is where the real danger lies. Discovery is a powerful legal tool, allowing parties to compel the production of documents, emails, photographs, and testimonies that might otherwise remain private. In a defamation case, Noah's legal team could request all communications between Trump and Epstein, all evidence of Trump's interactions at Mar-a-Lago, and even materials from his personal legal files related to Epstein. Every email, photograph, and note that intersects with Epstein could become subject to scrutiny. From a prosecutorial perspective, this is where Trump's threat against Noah becomes a double-edged sword. What starts as a bid to silence a comedian could inadvertently bring previously private and potentially damaging details into the public record. Satire might be protected, but the process of litigating this case could expose him to questions, subpoenas, and evidence requests that shine an unflattering light on his history with Epstein. In other words, while Trump may feel invincible based on his prior settlements against CBS and ABC, this scenario is fundamentally different. One involves complex corporate negotiations with media giants. The other is a public comedy performance protected by decades of legal precedent. And by escalating this to a lawsuit, Trump risks turning a brief joke into a prolonged legal spotlight on his own actions, exactly the scenario a careful attorney would caution against. This is why legal analysts are watching this situation closely. The intersection of satire, defamation law, and public figures is delicate, and the outcome is far from guaranteed. Trevor Noah's joke may have been brief, but the potential consequences of a lawsuit could be anything but. And that is the irony. In attempting to silence humor, Trump may inadvertently invite the most intense scrutiny of his relationship with Epstein yet. Now let's step back and examine the legal and strategic minefield that Trump could be stepping into. If he actually follows through on a defamation lawsuit against Trevor Noah over a joke about Epstein's Island, the legal consequences would be enormous and potentially self-defeating. This isn't speculation. It's the reality of U.S. civil litigation. Imagine this. Noah's legal team, armed with an unlimited right to pursue discovery, could subpoena virtually everything related to Trump's interactions with Jeffrey Epstein. Emails, texts, phone records, flight logs, photographs, financial documents, every scrap of communication between the two men would be fair game. Trump himself could be deposed under oath, compelled to answer detailed questions. How did you meet Epstein? How often did you socialize with him? Did you ever visit any of Epstein's properties? What did you know about Epstein's behavior toward young women? It doesn't stop there. Mar-a-Lago employees could be called to testify. Witnesses who saw Trump and Epstein together could be questioned. And every single document recently released by the Department of Justice, over 3 million pages, could be examined and scrutinized under oath. This is not theoretical. This is standard civil procedure. From a prosecutorial perspective, or any attorney analyzing this strategically, this is exactly the kind of exposure you avoid if your primary goal is to win a lawsuit. You don't open a case that invites your own conduct under intense public examination. But here's the catch. Trump is not thinking like a prosecutor. He's thinking like a politician, like someone who has long used the courts as a weapon. Let's look at the timeline. On January 30th, 2026, the DOJ released more than 3 million pages of Epstein files, claiming compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Congressional Democrats were quick to push back. Representative Ro Khanna, a co-sponsor of the law, pointed out that the DOJ had identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages, but was releasing only about 3.5 million. Ranking member Robert Garcia went further, asserting that Trump's DOJ was deliberately withholding roughly 50% of the files while simultaneously claiming full compliance. 3 days later, Trevor Noah cracks a joke on national television, referencing Epstein's infamous island and connecting it satirically to Trump. And Trump responds, not with clarification, not with a humorous counterstatement, but with a public lawsuit threat. Viewed through the lens of a prosecutor, this is a textbook example of narrative control. Trump is shifting the story. From being accused of withholding crucial information, he positions himself as the victim of false statements. He reframes the conversation, attempting to transform legal and political scrutiny into a story of personal offense. But here's the nuance that everyone must understand. Trump's Truth Social post claims, and I quote, "I have never been to Epstein Island nor anywhere close, and until tonight's false and defamatory statement, have never been accused of being there, not even by the fake news media." Technically, that statement is partially accurate. Most media reports focus on Trump's social connections to Epstein, his trips on Epstein's private jet, and mentions in DOJ files. Very few outlets explicitly claim Trump ever visited Little St. James, Epstein's U.S. Virgin Islands island. But here's the critical point. Trevor Noah never actually said Trump visited Epstein's island. Listen closely to the joke. Epstein's island is gone. He needs a new one to hang out with Bill Clinton. Noah's humor is a layered satirical commentary. He's making a joke about Trump desiring Greenland as a replacement, a ridiculous exaggeration that relies on audience understanding. No factual assertion about Trump setting foot on Little St. James is made. This is where Trump's threatened lawsuit begins to unravel from a legal perspective. Noah's quip is satire, which enjoys the broadest possible protection under the First Amendment, particularly when it concerns a public figure. And if the case goes forward, the DOJ files themselves, released just days earlier, directly contradict Trump's social media claim that he was never connected to Epstein's properties. Photographs show Trump at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. Flight logs place him on Epstein's private jet. Witness testimony indicates he was present at Epstein's Palm Beach residence. Now, none of this implies criminal liability. Trump has repeatedly stated he cut ties with Epstein around 2004, before Epstein's crimes became widely known. But in a defamation case over a joke, all of these interactions suddenly become material. Discovery would allow Noah's legal team to demonstrate that Trump had extensive contact with Epstein, visited multiple properties, and was mentioned thousands of times in federal investigation files. This evidence would not only defend the joke under truth as a defense, but would reinforce that Noah's statement was protected satire, not a factual claim. And then comes the question of actual malice. For a public figure like Trump, who is considered a public official in defamation law, the bar is incredibly high. To succeed, Trump would need to prove that Noah either knew the statement was false or acted with reckless disregard for its truth. How do you prove reckless disregard for a joke everyone understood as humor? You can't. Legal precedent, including Hustler versus Falwell, makes that clear. Outrageous parody and satire are shielded from defamation claims precisely because no reasonable person would interpret them as literal fact. But the implications go far beyond this one joke or lawsuit. Trump's approach is part of a systematic strategy to weaponize defamation law. The goal isn't to win trials, it's to create fear. News organizations, commentators, and comedians all take notice. Report something inaccurate or make a satirical quip about Trump, and you risk prolonged litigation and enormous settlement costs. ABC and CBS didn't settle because they were legally at fault. They settled because defending constitutional rights is expensive and time-consuming. The litigation itself becomes the punishment. And this, my friends, is where the stakes touch democracy itself. When journalists and entertainers self-censor out of fear of lawsuits, accountability erodes. Hard-hitting investigations are softened. Critical commentary is diluted. Robust debate, the kind the First Amendment was designed to protect, shrinks. Justice William Brennan articulated this principle in the landmark 1964 New York Times versus Sullivan decision. To preserve free debate, society must tolerate even harsh, caustic, and uncomfortable speech about public officials. Otherwise, critics are silenced and the public loses its right to know. Finally, consider the practical consequences. If Trump does file a lawsuit, Noah could force him into hours, maybe days of deposition. He would have to answer questions under oath, produce documents, and address every aspect of his interactions with Epstein. Trump's own lawyers understand this risk. Yet the threat persists. Why? Because Trump is counting on the chilling effect. He knows Noah, CBS, or other potential critics may decide the time, money, and hassle of litigation simply isn't worth it. The lawsuit need not succeed to achieve its strategic goal. The very threat reshapes behavior. In short, this isn't just about a joke. It's about power, narrative control, and the intersection of law and politics. It's about how defamation law can be exploited, not for justice, but for intimidation. And if Trump moves forward, the layers of legal, political, and personal exposure he faces could be far greater than any brief moment of embarrassment on a televised awards show. But here's where Donald Trump's calculation might hit a wall. Trevor Noah is not a major news organization, juggling relationships with sources, advertisers, and the fear of controversy. He's a comedian, one at the very end of his hosting run. He said it himself with a grin and a wink to the audience. "I told you it's my last year. What are you going to do about it?" That line wasn't just a punchline. It was a declaration that he had nothing to lose. And in the eyes of U.S. law, satire like this enjoys the strongest First Amendment protections of any kind of speech. Courts have consistently held that jokes about public figures, no matter how biting, sharp, or seemingly unfair, are protected unless they contain specific false factual statements that demonstrably damage a person's reputation. That means the most likely outcome from a legal standpoint is that Noah's joke is untouchable. He made no factual claim about Trump stepping foot on Epstein's island. He made a satirical comparison layered with humor and irony. Anyone reasonable watching the Grammys would have understood that. So, if Trump actually proceeds with this lawsuit, he's picking the worst possible defendant for his strategic ambitions, someone with ironclad legal defenses and nothing to lose. And in doing so, he opens himself up to a level of discovery that could touch his most politically sensitive vulnerabilities. Every email, photograph, flight record, and witness testimony about his interactions with Epstein could become subject to subpoena. From a prosecutor's point of view, this isn't litigation. It's a trap waiting to snap shut. Trump's Truth Social post reads like a message to potential critics. Look at what I did to ABC and CBS. I can do it to you too. It's a classic show of force meant to intimidate, but the legal system doesn't bend to bravado. Courts are structured to distinguish between factual news reports and satirical commentary. Judges have the authority to dismiss frivolous cases. Discovery rules are symmetrical. Both sides have rights and obligations. The law doesn't reward threats, it enforces principles. Here's the key point for everyone watching. This threatened lawsuit is not an isolated stunt. It is part of a broader, ongoing pattern of using litigation to suppress speech. Whether Trump ultimately files or not, the mere threat has already achieved part of its intended effect. Comedians, journalists, and public figures notice. They think twice before making statements that might provoke a lawsuit, chilling speech across media and culture. But every threat, every lawsuit, every settlement carries a paradoxical cost. When ABC settled, it renewed attention to past controversies, like the Eugene Carroll verdict. When CBS settled, questions arose about editorial practices across networks. And now, with Trump targeting Noah, millions of people are Googling Trump Epstein files to understand what the joke was about. Sometimes the attempt to suppress information generates far more attention than the original joke or story ever could. The irony is sharp, and it cuts to the heart of democratic accountability. The principle here is crucial. The rule of law relies on accountability for everyone, including the powerful. Journalists must be free to investigate without fear of intimidation. Comedians must be able to satirize without risk of legal retaliation. And citizens must be free to criticize their leaders without facing lawsuits designed to silence them. Trump's defamation strategy undermines all of this, not because the lawsuits have strong legal merit, but because the process itself chills speech, distorts public debate, and reshapes how Americans engage with information and power. So what happens next? Will Trump actually file this lawsuit? Will Trevor Noah and CBS mount a full-throated legal defense? Could this become another Hustler vs. Falwell moment where the Supreme Court once again reaffirms that satire, even when offensive or provocative, is a cornerstone of First Amendment protection? The answers matter, not just for comedians and media organizations, but for anyone who values accountability, transparency, and the free exchange of ideas in a democratic society. Stay informed, stay critical, and remember, protecting free speech isn't just about defending humor, it's about defending the very mechanisms that keep power in check. The next move in this drama will reverberate far beyond one joke on one night at the Grammys. It is a test of law, strategy, and the resilience of democratic principles under pressure.